A massive trade is incoming for the Toronto Maple Leafs as new reports have revealed that Timothy Liljegren and David Kampf are on the trade block. So to break that down, discuss exactly what the reports are and what kind of packages could the Leafs be getting in return for these players. I'm going to break all that down in this episode. But before we do, if you're part of the large percentage who aren't subscribed to the channel, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button. We're on the road to 12,000 subscribers. We make daily Leafs videos. And Darius, some interesting news came out yesterday from not only one player, but two potential trade options for the Toronto Maple Leafs this offseason, as they're currently in a very interesting spot. And let's just dive right into it. Let's not waste any more time. We're going to start with David Kampf, who's a guy that we haven't really discussed on the trade front very much until Nick Kypreos came out and said that David Kampf's situation as a Leaf could very well change before the start of next season, as the team might still make changes to the bottom six. Quote, there's a good chance the Leafs cut bait with David Kampf before then, meaning before the start of the regular season. Darius, this is very interesting, and we'll dive into a bunch of the reports, but I just want to get your thoughts on this first. Obviously, his contract's a bit of an interesting one. It's a bit of a hefty one, but David Kampf could be out of Toronto, according to Nick Kypreos.
Yeah, his contract, honestly, in my opinion, is pretty atrocious. And I thought it was when they signed it last summer. It really doesn't make sense for a player that does what he does, like his ceiling, right? So they're going to have to find a way to move on from him. I think at this point, I think he's useful, right? He's a useful player on any team, but making the money he makes with the salary cap structure that the Leafs have doesn't make sense. And honestly, if you do look at their bottom six, it is a little messy right now, right? Like you have Pontus Holmberg, who I think could play the role of David Kampf heading into next season. Maybe you get another better third line option, right? And the lines are all over the place. They're going to have to figure it out come training camp, right? And then what happens if an Easton Cowan makes the team too? Because it's a real possibility. A lot of people are talking about it, and development camp just wrapped up. So we'll get into that like in a later video. That's a whole separate topic. But I think for how much he makes and what he brings to the table, it doesn't make sense for the Leafs anymore. So it's going to be interesting to see. And in terms of what they'll get back, probably not much, right? Because this is not a very skillful player, and he makes a lot of money for what he does. And there's a lot of teams up against the cap. So I don't think they would get much in return, and they might actually have to give a bit of a sweetener. And I'm not saying like a first round pick or anything like that, but maybe a little sweetener for somebody to take him. But I just don't know if they can move forward with this player. I thought the contract was atrocious when they signed it last summer.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and that's the biggest thing, is that his contract is very rough, and that's why we haven't been discussing him in trade talks. But if you are able to cut bait with him and open up some cap space, maybe that space could be used on some better forwards, obviously to let Bertuzzi go. But you can see here from Evan, Maple Leafs forward David Kampf seemingly has no offseason in the latest Instagram story, 2 weeks removed from the Men's World Hockey Championships. There's a bunch of stuff going around with David Kampf. And again, we know that last season, after a quality season as a valued penalty killer and defensive forward, Brad Treliving re-signed into a 4-year, almost $10 million deal with a cap hit of $2.4 million. And then that contract ultimately aged pretty poorly if you are the Toronto Maple Leafs. And again, 19 points in 78 games for a guy you're paying almost $10 million over 4 years is not great roster management. Now, granted, the cap is going up, so it makes the hit a little bit less crazy, but Darius, it's just not what you want. And again, if they're really trying to change this team and change this core, not that David Kampf is a part of the core necessarily, even though he is only 29 years old, cutting bait with this player and giving up a pick to open up some spots to potentially sign some other guys that are available in the free agency market seems like the way to go. And it seems like, according to Nick Kypreos, that seems very likely at this point. According to him.
Yeah, David Kampf's been working out, as you can see there. He's putting in work for the offseason, heading into next season. But yeah, I don't think David Kampf's a bad player. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I think with the salary cap structure of the Leafs, you have to move on from this player. You have to find a way to maybe offload him, because it just doesn't make sense anymore. And when you look at last season, like you were showing his point totals, right? He's not going to score a bunch of points for you. That's not what he's there for. He's going to chip in here and there throughout the course of a season. But he's a penalty killer. He's a fourth liner, and I thought the fourth line was pretty good in the playoffs too. But the penalty kill was not. And you can chalk that up to, maybe it was personnel, maybe it was coaching, whatever it is. They'll figure it out this season, right? I don't know. It might have something to do with the personnel too. Maybe it's time to move on, right? Because the rest of the structure of the forwards doesn't really make sense to me right now. Like, I can't see a vision. I can see it with the goaltending. I can see it with the defense. I can't really see it with the forwards right now. And there's still a guy like Daniel Sprong out there too, who could really help you in your lineup. And like I said, I could see him as a playoff performer. So he's still out there. but they're going to have to offload some salary. Their salary cap structure right now is not great.
Yeah, and we thought that they were going to be making moves already at this point by now regarding the forwards after they let Bertuzzi go and they re-signed Max Domi, but they haven't done that yet. So let us know your thoughts around the David Kampf situation with Darius. We also have Timothy Liljegren to discuss, as Timothy Liljegren may still be traded despite signing an extension with the Leafs, according to Chris Johnson. We'll see if Timothy Liljegren maybe still gets traded. I know he was signed to a 2-year extension, but I don't think you can entirely rule out a trade in his circumstance yet. They're still going to keep chipping away at the roster, and this is something that you brought up, that I brought up as well when they made the move, is that this 2-year deal that he signed is ultimately a much more tradable contract than him being a RFA and with all the with the qualifying offer. So it makes a lot of sense if they could trade him, especially, and I think a lot of it might depend on what Yanni Hakanpää's future is in Toronto as well.
I think that does have a big part of it, right? Because they haven't officially announced that signing yet. But, we had a live stream on July 1st in free agency, and both of us at the same time, when they made that signing, said, why? Are they going to trade this player? That was our first instinct, right? And like mentioned before, and like you alluded to too, them signing him to this contract, I think makes him way more appealing to other teams in a trade, because if he wasn't signed and he was still an RFA, he could have filed for salary arbitration, and teams do not want to deal with that, right? So the fact that they signed him to this contract, whether it be overvalued or whatever you think it is, it might be a little bit in my estimation, but I think it makes him more available to other teams. Like it's more appetizing to other teams that to want to trade for this guy with a contract already signed. So I still think he's on the trade block for sure. And I think it depends on, the future of Hakanpää and how that all goes and how that wraps up in the next week or two, because hopefully it's soon, right? You would hope if you were the Leafs, it was going to wrap up soon, but very interesting situation. I still think he's definitely on the trade block.
Yeah, and he's still a very good player, but at this contract, and I'll show the stats one more time here. Again, 23 points, 55 games. Again, it's a defenseman, so the points don't matter as much. Blocked a handful, a fair amount of shots, sorry. But I don't know. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense in this current structure if they keep Timothy Liljegren around, if Yanni Hakanpää is a guy that they're going to keep. Now, I'll ask you this, Darius. If Yanni Hakanpää doesn't get signed officially, I think they have no choice but to keep him unless they're getting a defenseman back in some sort of trade with Liljegren getting sent out, or maybe at this point, I think it would make the most sense for them to try to acquire a forward if they do trade Liljegren because of the lack of depth they have at the forward position. And maybe they trade for, again, the Mitch Marner trade is still something that's up in the air and that could happen with whatever team he ultimately ends up potentially going to, whether that's Nashville, Vegas. If he gets traded, maybe they'll get a defenseman back. I think a lot of it, there's a lot of offseason left for the Leafs, and every single move depends on tons of things. If they trade David Kampf, they could get a better forward, like you mentioned, Daniel Sprong, and then that means that maybe in a different trade for Liljegren, they get the different piece of asset. There's just a lot of moving parts right now. That's why I think that we said the Marner trade was going to have to happen first, but I think they're pretty set on keeping him at this point. We don't know for sure, but it seems like that's the case right now. So.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. There's a lot that can still go on, right? And if you're trading Timothy Liljegren, I don't think you're going to get a defender that's like as good as him back. So you probably look at a forward, like you said, in that way. So it's going to be interesting. If Hakanpää doesn't end up signing, I wonder if you do keep Liljegren, because you're going to need that depth anyway, but it doesn't make the contract any better. I still think it's a bit of a shocking contract for what he's produced so far. I think the contract, like I said, makes him easier to trade, but it's still a pretty shocking contract. And I still think he's a great player and he would do great somewhere else for sure with more playtime and all that, but I'm not sure it works for the Leafs at this point. And it's a little bit of a rich contract for, like we've keep saying throughout this video, their salary cap structure.
Yeah, I agree. And ultimately, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Timothy Liljegren. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with David Kampf and the bottom six, as well as the offseason continues to roll on here. But that'll wrap it up. Let us know in the comments your thoughts are on all this. We'll see you soon.